Hello, and welcome to the International Quilt Museum's virtual First Friday. I'm Maren Hansen. I'm curator of international collections at the International Quilt Museum, and I am so pleased to have you with us virtually this evening. And I am thrilled to be able to introduce to you the musician and quilt maker Eliza Hardy Jones, who will be giving tonight's virtual First Friday program. Eliza is a quilt maker and internationally touring musician, singer, and songwriter from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She tours with Grammy-nominated artists Iron and Wine and Grace Potter, in addition to releasing her own original music. She has given talks on her quilts across the US and in Russia, and her work has been featured in various quilt publications. Now, tonight she's going to be talking specifically about her song quilts project, and we currently have a group of her song quilts on view in the Pumphrey Family Gallery at the International Quilt Museum. We reopened to the public this week, so we hope you get a chance to come by and see them in person. The Song Quilts project is just fascinating to me, and you'll learn a lot more about it when Eliza comes on. But let me tell you just a little bit about it. What Eliza did was she traveled across the US and Northwest Russia, recording folk songs sung by women, which she then transcribed into written music. Next, she developed a notation method that translates pitch, the highness or lowness of a sound, into color and rhythm into shape. The resulting quilts are read from top left to bottom right. She selected predominant colors and quilting patterns to reflect her impressions of the song, the singer, and the experiencing of sharing music with her. So I think you'll find Eliza's explanation um, very edifying. It's a fascinating process that she developed to turn music into quotes, and maybe it will give you a little bit of inspiration. If you are creative in several different areas, maybe you can bring those two areas of creativity together in a similar way that Eliza did. So, without further ado, I'd like to or I would like to hand it over to Eliza. But first, I actually would like to thank for their ongoing support the International Quilt Museum Friends and the Nebraska Arts Council. So, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and I'm handing it over to Eliza. Eliza Hardy Jones, take it away.
Hello, my name is Eliza Hardy Jones, and I want to thank you for joining me today to learn about my Song Quilts project, which is on display right now at the International Quilt Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska. But if, like me, you are stuck at home and unable to travel to the museum, I hope that this presentation gives you the opportunity to learn about the quilts and about the stories behind the quilts. The Song Quilts project is an oral history quilting musical project that I developed back in 2016 after being given the opportunity to travel to the Russian Arctic for an artist residency. What I've done in the last few years is I've traveled around the United States of America and to the Russian Arctic, where I've interviewed women who share with me traditional folk songs and stories about their lives. Then I take those songs back to my studio, I transcribe them, and I developed a visual transcription method that I then turn into quilts. These are not metaphoric interpretations of how the songs make me feel, but in fact exact transcriptions of the songs as the women sang them. So today I will teach you how to read the quilts, but also share with you the songs and the stories behind the quilts. This project for me has been an amazing way to look at how women's traditions, folk music, textile work, weaving, embroidery, and quilting, how all of these things have contributed to our cultural identity, how we understand ourselves in the world, and how those traditions continue to contribute to global culture and also connect us to each other across traditions and borders. So I hope today, as we visit with each of these women and learn some of their stories, that it allows you to think about the many ways in which how you understand yourself has been informed by so many voices and so many traditions, and that's a really beautiful thing. So I'd like to begin today by singing Katyusha for you. It's a Russian song but it was taught to me by my great aunt Virginia. So this is my great aunt Virginia's version of Katyusha that I remember from my childhood. Rozkwitali jabłoni I gruszy, poplili tumanu na rękoj. Wychodziła na biereg Katyusza, na wiosułkę biereg nam krutoj. Wychodziła na biereg Katyusza, na wiosułkę biereg nam krutoj. Wychodziła, pieśnią zawodziła, Prastatnego sizorgo orla, Pratago, которого любила, Pratago, чепясно берегла. Ай-яй-яй-яй-яй-яй-яй, а любовь Катюша сбережет. So let's start here in 1982. When my Aunt Virginia gave her final vocal performance. Here she is pictured with me sitting on one of her quilts from her quilt collection. And she gave that last performance on her farm in Hope, New Jersey. And my father, pictured there in the background playing harmonica, recorded it. And when she finished her performance, people called for an encore, and she sang Katyusha, one of her favorite of the Russian folk songs that she had learned. My great aunt Virginia Bartow decided to revive her singing career in the late 1930s. After the stock market crash, her father had committed suicide, her husband had had a nervous breakdown and left her, and she was left a struggling single mother of a young son. And so she took a job singing sheet music at Lord & Taylor's. And there, through a mutual friend, she was introduced to Andrew Salama, who became the great love of her life. And the years she spent with him, she frequently referred to as the most exciting years of her life. Andrew Salama was a Russian composer, arranger, and performer from Moscow. He was part of the Chauve-Souris, which was an after-hours cabaret theater that happened in the basement of the Moscow theater under Stanislavski. Nikita Baliev, who ran the Chauve-Souris after the Russian Revolution, fled the country along with Salama and most of the performers. And they had great success in New York, doing their brand of exuberant Russian cabaret theater. When things were going well for the theater and for the economy in general, Salama was able to buy himself a little hunting lodge in the Delaware Water Gap that he named Salamovka. And Salamovka was full of Russian artists, dancers, composers, and painters who spent their summers there in great music making and excitement. My Aunt Virginia started taking voice lessons with Salama, and that is how she met him and fell in love with him. And when she got her divorce settlement, she paid off the mortgage on Salamovka. So here she is sitting on the porch with Salama and her son Nevet. And Salamovka, this house itself, is such an important piece of my family story. My parents met here. My grandmother spent so many wonderful years here. And my Aunt Virginia loved this place more than anything. So this was the place that she learned all of these great Russian folk songs. Salama spent his later years just handwriting out every song he could remember from his childhood. And he became one of the only composers. Virginia maintains that he was the only composer who was writing and arranging Russian folk music in America in the 1940s and 50s. After his death, he gave all of his papers to Virginia, and now I have all of those papers. So armed with this handwritten version of Katyusha, Andrew Salama's arrangement of Katyusha, and the 1982 recording, I decided to develop this Song Quilts project. So I took this song first, and I had to now come up with a transcription method. And I started with rhythm. And so what I decided was a 4-inch square would be a quarter note. If I wanted to do smaller rhythms, eighth notes, those are going to be half square triangles. Of course, I could have chosen any number of ways to represent this, but as a quilter, the half square triangle is at the root of our system of expression, so I went with the half square triangle. If there's a rhythm longer than a quarter note, you end up with rectangles. So this half note would be a 4 by 8 rectangle. Here are some examples that you might see in quilts. You can see that when you syncopate a quarter note or end up with a dotted quarter note, you end up with these very fun slanted rhythms. And if you have faster rhythms, like down on the bottom there with the 16th notes, you can see that they end up into even smaller divisions of half square triangles. So that's how the rhythm works. Now, to develop the pitches, I decided that those would be colors. So I relate pitch resonance to harmonic resonance. And I have a very esoteric system that's very complicated to understand, but has very strict rules. So I promise you each of these quilts follows those rules. But the basic version of that is that the 1 is the first note of the scale, and that's going to start with the color that feels most like the song to me. And then as I move to the next primary chord, the 4 chord, I add a primary color. So you can see here, I move from red to yellow. And then I have to move to the other primary chord, the 5 chord. And from here, I move from red to that sort of bluish purple. I don't get all the way to blue, but I'm adding that primary color blue. And then the notes in between are a progression of pitches. So these are the pitches I ended up with for Katyusha. And so this is how it comes together. You end up with the rhythm and the pitches, and then underneath a sash. And those sashes are chord changes. So here is that first line of Katyusha. Svitali yablini igrushi, paplili tumanu narekoi. So those white spaces in any of the quilts are rests, and everything else is rhythmic and melodic demonstration. So all together, this is my Aunt Virginia singing Katyusha. The quilt behind me is all 5 verses of Katyusha, which I made so that I could sleep under it. It's the size of a bed quilt. But for the exhibit at the International Quilt Museum, I did it just how she sang it, just 2.5 verses. So I encourage you to go to the website, my website or the International Quilt Museum's website, where you will be able to hear my Aunt Virginia singing this song in all of her 80-year-old glory. The other way that I have to bring the woman into the quilt and I'm able to add meaning is through the quilting itself. So what I do is I find a regional textile design or something specific to the woman, and then I quilt that in. So for this, I used the embroidery, I guess this is a weaving pattern, the weaving pattern of Muscovite sarafans. Katyusha is a song that is related to the Moscow tradition. So I used these kinds of patterns that I saw in the sarafan embroideries. So you can see that here up close, some of those different geometric designs. And the last little way that I add some meaning is through the backing fabric. In the Moscow tradition, in women's headscarves and also in the panel on the front of their dresses, they frequently wear rose patterns. So I found this beautiful cave facet rose print and I used that for the backing fabric. So for each of these quilts, I'm able to put in meaning in each of the steps, in the rhythm, in the color, and then in the quilting and in the backing fabric choices. So that's how I pull together the quilts. The first interview that I did for the quilt project that wasn't, a member of my family was this woman here, Marcella Werman of Oakland, Nebraska, which is not far from the Quilt Museum. So I spent a long afternoon with Sally as she sang dozens of songs for me that she remembered from her childhood. So here she is singing Cowboy Jack.
He was just a lonely cowboy with a heart so brave and true, and he learned to love a maiden with eyes of heaven's own blue. They learned to love each other, and he named their wedding day. When a quarrel came between them, and Jack, he rode away, he joined a band of cowboys and tried to forget her name. But out on that lonely prairie,
was Cowboy Jack, a traditional Western song sung by Sally, who you can see here as a young woman with her husband on their farm. Now, Sally has lived on this farm for over 70 years. She raised all 7 of her children there, and she moved there when she married her husband, but she was in fact the daughter of farmers as well. When she was a child, her father bought a guitar off of a traveling cowboy, and that began her love affair with music. And she would listen to the radio, and she would learn songs off of the radio, and then play them herself. And she would go down to the Farmers Union meeting hall, where her father was the president of the Farmers Union in the 30s, and she would entertain the farmers at their meetings. And she would also play on the local West Point, Nebraska radio station. So learning music off of the radio and playing music on the radio was a really important part of Sally's life. It's also a really important part of the American story. In the 1930s, the US government, through the Library of Congress, sent out ethnomusicologists, Alan Lomax and such, to gather up all of the American folk songs. And they felt like that was so important for us to understand what the American music tradition was, what set us apart from other music traditions. And we know in this country that American folk music is a mixture of the European immigrant populations, the Oompa from Germany and Poland and Eastern Europe, the fiddle music of the Irish and Scottish traditions, the rhythms and melodies of the African tradition, and also some of the melodic elements of our Native American traditions. So all of those things mixed together as people lived the first several hundred years of this country's history. And then in the 1930s, you had people going out to capture these songs. And once they were captured and played on the radio, they spread across the entire country. So instead of having small pockets of regional traditions, you started having young girls in Nebraska learning all of the Appalachian folk tunes from across the country. And also some of the good Western tunes as well. So when I had to decide how to start the quilt, I looked out here at Sally's barn across from her house and saw that beautiful blue Nebraska sky. And that last line of the song is, "He sees her eyes, heaven's own blue." So I went with that Nebraska blue sky for the root of this song. And you can see it's a rather large quilt. She does sing 9 verses of this Western tale. And I love how the pitch patterns really vary from the beginnings and endings of phrases that you can see here. This is a picture of Sally's living room, and you can see how music is really in the heart of that it's such an important piece of her life. And you can also see all of these beautiful browns and yellows and golds. So I went and found a nice vintage sheet that picked up on some of those browns and golds and used that as the backing fabric. You can see that I've quilted it with a double wedding ring pattern. As Sally and I sat on her couch eating pie and singing songs for each other, we were sitting on a double wedding ring quilt that was laying out across the couch. So I brought it all together to tell Sally's story in this Cowboy Jack quilt.
The next song I would like to share with you is A Little Stream of Honey, which was taught to me by Vernice Donnells of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Just a mile west of the water tank on a cold December day, in a dark and lonely boxcar, a dying hobo lay. His friends all gathered round him, willow and sinking heads, listening to the last word their dying buddy said. Oh, goodbye, old partner hobos, I hate to say goodbye, but my time is drawing nearer and I hear it coming nigh. Oh, tell that old conductor he always makes a stop when a little stream of honey comes running down the rock. Oh, I'm going to that better place where everything is right, where the handouts grow on bushes and we sleep out every night. Oh, we won't have to wash our overalls or even change our socks, and a little stream of honey comes running down the rocks.
So that was Vernice Donnell's version of A Little Stream of Honey. Bernice is an amazing woman that I've met here in Philadelphia. She is a singer, storyteller, radio producer, scholar, poet, quilter, textile maker, and garment maker. And she is so full of life and has so many great stories to tell. And when I sat with her and she sang for me, and she sang me this song, this Hobo song, and I asked her what that song meant to her, and she told me the story of growing up. So her parents were married in the United States, but her father was Uzbek and her mother was West Indian Arapaho. And when they married, they were actually breaking the law because we had anti-miscegenation laws here in the United States that meant that people from different races couldn't marry each other. But the people who issued the license did not understand that there were differences between brown people. And so her parents were allowed to marry. After she was born, she really struggled. Her mother really struggled to raise twins, Vernice and Vern. And they actually lived at a squatters encampment in Seattle. And one day the government came and shut down this encampment and said everybody has to leave. So Vernice's mother was able to gather enough money to buy a train ticket to relocate her family to Milwaukee. But all she had was enough for this train ticket. So when they got onto the train, at night, Vernice and her brother Vern would sneak out into the corridor and they would take food off of people's plates that they had, put outside to be taken away. And a porter saw these young children scrounging for food, and she told me that in the morning there was food for them in their cabin, and that the porters looked out for them, and that the children and their mother had enough for the rest of the many-day journey to Milwaukee. So this song about a hobo finding that place where the honey comes streaming from the rock really resonated with her. That idea of charity and goodwill and of somebody really looking out for her meant a great deal to her. Once she was in Milwaukee, she and her family found their way to the Baha'i community. The Baha'i faith is a traditional faith that really believes in the equality of all people. And in the 1960s, that was a revolutionary idea. And Vernice, being a person of color, living in poverty, was not given the same opportunities or the same attention that other children were being given, and she was really suffering in school, despite being a brilliant young student. So finding the Baha'i community gave her the ability to discover all of her potential and to feel appreciated and included and to really live up to all that she had to offer. And she has quite a bit to offer the world. So that faith continues to be a really important part of her identity and her tradition. And part of that faith is that she doesn't drink. Now, if you were to try to look up this song, A Little Stream of Honey, you would find that the original title of the song is A Little Stream of Whiskey. And the song is in fact about a hobo, going to paradise where the whiskey would run freely. But that didn't resonate with her. So she changed the lyrics to A Little Stream of Honey, which brought it to a place of faith and spirituality that's so important to her. And that tradition of changing lyrics, changing melodies, moving things around is such an important part of the American folk tradition. And so I loved that she had taken this traditional song and just made it her own. The other place that she made it her own is at the end. So you can see here, the song happens on a grid. You can see there's some embellishments, but for the most part, things are happening in the grid. And then those last two lines, the grid breaks down as she sings an improvised coda.
To the last words their dying buddy said, sweet honey in the rocks, it tastes like honey in the rock.
So in order to really highlight that idea of sweet honey in the rock, for both the quilting and the backing fabric, I went with that honeycomb pattern in order to bring some of Vernice's exuberance into this purple quilt. But this project isn't just about interviewing women from the United States. It's also about traveling up to Russia. So I just wanted to start with a little geography. You can see that star there represents Moscow, the northern capital of Moscow. And if you go all the way up to the tip of that orange arrow, we are in Arkhangelsk, which is where my residency was hosted. From Arkhangelsk, I took a 24-hour train north through the tundra up to that blue arrow in Murmansk. So when I did my interviews, I'm either in one of those two places here. Here I am with Ekaterina Sharova of the Arctic Art Institute. Ekaterina is the one who hosted my residency and was my guide and translator through all of my travels. And here we are in front of some of the beautiful paintings of the Russian North. Folk art is so important to the Arctic culture, to the Russian North. While right now the North is really important for military and economic strategic purposes, the people of the Arctic feel like what they have to offer the world is their traditional culture. Their music and painting and weaving traditions are all so important to them. So I feel honored that I am able to share some of those things with you today. So let's just take a quick peek at some of those traditions. The most important one is just the architecture. So these are people living in an Arctic landscape, and so they are creating beauty absolutely everywhere, in the windowsills, underneath the roof, in the eaves, on the interior, on the exterior. Their tools, their towels, their clothing, absolutely everything is adorned in incredible detail and beauty. And one of the really important things is weaving. So weaving is the first currency. It's the first way to express language. So for ancient cultures, weaving and the weavers are such an important part of their traditions. And the Russian Arctic culture is truly a very, very ancient culture. So as you walk down the main street in Arkhangelsk, you see this statue to the weaver. And even their distaffs, their prialkas, are incredibly beautiful and representative of what region or what village you're in. So you can see they're painted either with beautiful illustrations, or they're carved, or they're painted and carved. Up top, you see those little knobs. If two of the knobs are broken off, that means that the weaver is married and off the market, so keep your distance. So there's all kinds of beautiful ways that people are communicating through their tools. And here are some of the weavings that you might see in the north. Most of them are red and white or black and white, and I was told that if you are weaving 4 months out of the year in total darkness by candlelight, that you're going to want to weave with red and white or black and white because you can see them better. So when you go to the south, if you remember that Moscow Serafin, very, very colorful. Up north, lots of red and white. And that tradition is still very alive today. I was able to visit the children's folk school. You can see some of the girls here learning the traditional weaving techniques. These are some of the things that they've created. You can see the incredible skill and detail. And each of these weaving designs is specific to a region or to a village or a town. There's also box making, basket making, wood carving, clothing making, and quilting. Quilting is a very, very important part of the Arctic art tradition, and they're very proud of their quilt designs. One fun little detail, when I was in Arkhangelsk and told people that I was a quilter, everybody wanted to share with me this Arkhangelsk quilt pattern. This is the official block of Arkhangelsk, which I thought was so interesting because it is also the official block of Alabama. So here's Lucy Mingo with one of her pine burr quilts. Off to the side, you see a little Timnatar pine burr so that you get a close-up of the technique of it. But how interesting that both Arkhangelsk and Alabama claim the pine burr as their own. So while I was up in Arkhangelsk, I was able to visit the Northern Academic Folk Choir. So just as I was saying, in the United States, the government sent out these ethnomusicologists to capture all of the songs of the country because it was of absolute importance to American identity and American cultural heritage. The same thing was happening in Soviet Russia. So in 1926, Antonina Kolotilova was sent off into the tundra, into the Russian Arctic, to gather up all of the best singers who kept all of the incredible traditions of the folk songs. And at this point, we're talking about songs that have existed since the 14th century is about the earliest I was hearing songs were from, and bringing them to Arkhangelsk to start this choir. The Northern Academic Folk Choir traveled throughout the Eastern Bloc, during the Soviet era and now continue to travel. It's an 80-person troupe right now. But as you can see, traditionally, and even now today, while there are men in the company who play instruments and who are dancers, only women sing. And that's something that's very unique to the Russian Arctic tradition. In the United States, men sing, women sing, we're all singing as part of the tradition. But in the Russian Arctic tradition, women are the singers, women are the keepers of that vocal tradition. So here is a modern day performance of 4 of the leaders of the Northern Academic Folk Choir singing and dancing to Vdol Potravkia.
You are working on the grass, yeah?
Okay.
Вдоль по травке, вдоль по муравке, вдоль по травке, вдоль по муравке, по лазуревым цветочкам, по лазуревым цветочкам, по цветочкам, во всю ночь, куда по цветочкам, во всю ночь. Ходила гуляла красная девка, ходила гуляла красная девка, танцевала, приустала, танцевала, приустала, приустала, задремала, приустала, задремала. Молодец, гусли играют, молодец, гусли играют, сам девушку спотешают, сам девушку спотешают, сам девушка лебедушка, да сам девушка лебедушка, вон едет твой батюшка, да вон едет твой батюшка, я батюшки не боюсь, да я батюшки не боюсь, родимого не стыжусь, да родимого не стыжусь.
So here is a modern picture of the Northern Academic Folk Choir. This is the cover of one of the CDs that they gave me, the many CDs they have of recordings of their music. They're an incredibly talented group, and I was really, really honored to be able to spend the day with them and learn about their history. So I took that sort of color palette from here to pick the starting colors for the Vdol Potravkia quilt. And you can see here that there's some different rhythmic patterns, some short little trills that are happening and some yips that are happening in there. So it was a very fun one to problem solve for me for how I was going to capture these different vocal styles. For the quilting pattern, I wanted to honor this idea that each of the regions had their own weaving pattern. And this is the Arkhangelsk pattern. So this is a mural in downtown Arkhangelsk. The muralist painted her own grandmother weaving the design. Here's a up close version of it. And then here you can see that I've quilted that to the best of my ability into the Vdol Potravkia quilt. And for the backing fabric, I actually just went down to the fabric row in Arkhangelsk and I visited some different fabric stores and I bought lots of fabric while I was there. And when I got home, it just so happened that this one matched the color palette of the quilt that I had made. So I lucked out on that one. Next, I would like to introduce to you Nadezhda Mironova. And she was actually one of the leaders of the Northern Academic Folk Choir, but has since moved back to Moscow where she has started her own group called Art Tradition. And they do a sort of very traditional, ancient Russian folk music / jazz fusion version. But she's also an expert in teaching the traditional way of singing. So when I was talking about Vdol Potravkia and how I had to figure out how to capture those trills and yips that happen in their voices, Nadezhda is an absolute expert in how to use her voice. There's a slightly more nasal quality. The place that you put your voice is a different place than we do as modern singers, but it's very, very similar to that sort of like nasal call of the Appalachian tradition. So I love that connection as well, that there's a traditional way of singing that connects, again, the Southern American and Northern Russian traditions. So here is Nadezhda singing a little bit of svecha, which means candle.
Небо гореньке свеча горит, небо гореньке свеча горит. свеча горит воску ярово, свеча горит воску ярово. Там сидит красная девица, там сидит красная.
So that was Nadezhda singing Svecha, which means candle. And Svecha is a wedding song. Just like in the United States, our folk songs sort of fall into categories that tell different kinds of stories. The same thing is true in Russia. And the wedding song is very, very important because people were getting together to sing and dance and have village festivals frequently around weddings. But interestingly, the wedding songs are frequently very sad. They often include a woman actually wailing as part of the song. And when I asked the women who sang for me different wedding songs, why are the wedding songs so sad? What they told me was this, that in our lives, we have three passages. We have a passage from unbeing to being when we are born. And when we pass into being, it is painful, and so we cry. And we have a passage from being to unbeing when we die, and it is painful, so we cry. And the third passage is when we pass from childhood to adulthood, and that is when we marry. And the passage is painful, so we cry. And I just thought that was a really beautiful way of looking at that, and something I hadn't thought of, that it's not that the wedding is sad, that she's leaving her family, or that she doesn't love her husband, or that it's an arranged marriage, or whatever it is. It's just the idea that passage is painful, and so we cry. In order to honor this wedding tradition, I tried to find my root color based on this wedding attire. So this would be the wedding from the Pinega River Valley, and this song is a Pinega River Valley song. So you can see the incredible adornment of the hat and the beautiful sarafan. And note here too that beautiful indigo dye, that's important. So here is a not amazing picture, I'm sorry, of the quilt, but you can see the different colors. Again, some of those trills that we had in the other quilt. And then the quilting itself is based on these. So these are called the Mother of Worlds, or the Sun Chariots, or the Sun Maidens. And underneath we have the Tree of Life. So in the North, the weaving patterns frequently depict sun chariots who carry the Mother of Worlds, and then many different trees of life. And this is, the sun chariot is a horse bird chariot. It's usually sort of half horse, half bird. And it's always split in the middle. So it's not a two-headed animal. It's two animals that are connected. And that is generally because the year is split into two. Again, we're talking about the Arctic rhythm. So we don't have 4 seasons. We really have 2 seasons. And frequently the goddess of the world, the Mother of Worlds, has horns. She has these elk horns because she is a elk-horned goddess. So these are coming from incredibly ancient traditions that were passed on and on and on. As you go further into the 19th century, the sun chariots and the Mother of Worlds turn into more flower and tree designs, and that's simply because of the progress of Christianity there. They wanted to sort of mute out the more pagan symbols. But you can see here that I used one of these elk-horned goddesses riding a sun chariot as my quilting pattern. Now, how we know that she's in the sky is that she's always above birds. So I have split my quilt into rows of the Mother of Worlds, and then some of the Tree of Life figures, and then some of these 2-headed birds, which represent weddings. So I tried to bring in some of those traditions, weaving traditions, painting traditions, and the symbiographic traditions of the North as I designed my quilt. And the last thing is that indigo dye, which is really important. So throughout the Arctic, you had traveling indigo salesmen who would bring both fabric, dye, and printing blocks. So they do an indigo resist dye with a block. I was actually able to order this traditional indigo block dye from Moscow. So this is Russian indigo resist dye fabric. So it was a real wonderful chance to be able to play with that fabric, which I just think is so incredibly beautiful. And that bird, again, that you see here, is a very important design that you'll see throughout the Russian North. So there's a look into some of the quilts from my Song Quilt series. I hope you enjoyed traveling around and spending time with these women as much as I did. There are 10 quilts at all in this series, so if you are able, please do visit the International Quilt Museum in Nebraska. And if you're not able, please visit their website for a virtual tour or my website in order to see some more of the quilts and learn more of the stories behind them. And I hope that this inspires you and encourages you to look around at all of the incredible, diverse voices and stories that surround us and how those stories and voices enrich our lives and bring so much beauty to our lives. So thank you and have a great day.